Thanks for tuning in to the Women's Vibrancy Code, a podcast dedicated to helping women move from exhausted to energized, balance their hormones, and feeling turned on by their life, their lover, and themselves. I'm your host, Maraya Brown. I'm a Yale and functional medicine trained women's health expert, midwife, mom, keynote speaker, and self-made entrepreneur. I'm the founder of my signature program, the Women's Vibrancy Code. So sit back, relax, and let's chat about your energy, hormones, libido, and embracing your feminine power. Oh, and you might want to have pen and paper to take some notes on some of these episodes. Okay, so everyone listening in the podcast, welcome back to the Women's Vibrancy Code podcast. I'm thrilled to have this conversation. We're going to be talking about women in groups and clearing mental clutter so that we can be present. And I have Tanya Cole-Lesnick with me. I'm going to read her bio and then let's just get the show on the road. For those of you listening in Facebook, of course, I would love to just give a thumbs up. Let us know where you're watching from. You're welcome to ask questions. You're welcome to, I can tag Tanya on this. And Tanya, if you want to go back and have interaction with them, let's have this conversation. So Tanya Cole-Lesnick has been a psychotherapist, a licensed clinical social worker, and coach since 1995. That's when I graduated from high school, Tanya.
Yeah, I've been doing it a while.
She received her master's degree in social work from New York University after group therapy changed her life. She has extensive experience in outpatient hospital mental health, private practice, and wellness center settings. And you spell center the British way.
Oh, that was a mistake, but I am half British. That's funny. My mother.
Go ahead.
My mother was British.
Okay, I wondered. Okay, it's coming through. Okay, from those experiences over the years, she has identified her most important focus, which is helping people to clear energetic clutter so they can focus on what matters most to them. And so obviously she's doing that from a mental health perspective and group dynamic. Off camera, we were talking a little bit around when women are in group dynamics, the mental clutter that can show up, sometimes the fear of being judged, the cattiness, the competitiveness, whatever might come up, the fear of being vulnerable and really speaking your heart's dreams or the imperfections. And so we're definitely going to be talking about group dynamics here. So she does this by helping clients to access and honor their truth, to change habits that don't serve them, and to heal faulty narratives so that they are living in alignment inside and out. Her work revolves around a combination of intimate therapeutic groups and individual sessions as the sharing of inner worlds and being human together in a safe space, collectively and individually, is an incredibly powerful combination that leads to lasting transformation. Woo, that's a mouthful. Tanya, anything you want to add? Welcome.
Oh, thank you. I'm just so happy to be here. And I know we were touching a tiny bit earlier. I think there's so much overlap in the work that we do. And I think ultimately helping people to connect to themselves. And how do you get there?
Yeah. And so connecting to ourselves for the sake of?
For the sake of being more present, being able to connect to other people from a real honest place of showing up fully as who we are, if we're able to connect to ourselves, to even identify intuition, to know what our hearts are telling us.
Yeah. And when you work with individuals and groups and the light turns on, so to speak, to feeling deeply connected with themselves and listening inside, what then comes of that? What changes do you see in who they be in the world, their relationships, how they exist in the group?
I'd love if I could just to touch on my own story because
Yeah.
it changed my life and it's very much to answer this question. So
Hmm.
when I was in my mid 20s and I was really struggling to have a long-term love relationship. And so I really was sort of considering therapy, but I felt a lot of stigma. I was afraid of it. And then with some time, I ended up connecting to a therapist who suggested I add group therapy to the mix, which really terrified me. So, like we were touching on a little bit earlier, this idea of who's going to judge me and the fear of sharing some vulnerable stuff with other people. At this time in my life, because I was struggling to have a love relationship, I was making up answers to myself. What is in the way? What do I think the problem is? And really went in with this sense that maybe there was a part of me that wasn't lovable. So going into this
Mm.
group situation, which I decided I would do, was scary. I was really worried that it would prove that I was unlovable. And
Ah.
so being able to be in that space with other people and seeing other humans struggle with insecurities, but being able to see how amazing they were helped create a bit of a crack in my own story that maybe there was more to it than me just being unlovable. And over time of connecting to myself in that way, I was able to show up more fully, more embodied. I was able to be more present with other people. And my life started to shift, which is why I ended up deciding to become a therapist and then later doing
Mm.
personal development coaching and all that. But it was really that experience of coming back into my body and being able to start to love myself, understand needs. And now I've forgotten the question that I was trying to answer, but it was
Oh, but
something
that's it.
about that. Yeah.
Yeah. What then happens when and what I heard
Mm-hmm.
is for someone who's listening,
Mm-hmm.
if you're like, ooh, showing vulnerability in front of others, it's like the,
Yeah.
what is it in, well, I'm not going to go there, but we're in that there is an assumption that I'm going to be judged, or that when I show that vulnerable part, that I'm actually not lovable. And so what I'm hearing is that you acknowledged the assumption
Mm-hmm.
and had to really look at, I'm assuming I'm not lovable.
Mm-hmm.
But then here I am when I take the plunge and I'm willing to be in this group and see their beauty and see their vulnerability and love them more. Well, maybe, just maybe, they're doing the same to me.
That's right.
And the thing that's holding me back or that's in my way is not actually the people in the group. It's my assumption that I'm not lovable.
That's right. That's right. And what would happen when I operated in the world with that assumption in place is I would curate how I showed up. And so there was a lot of mental energy. I mean, speaking of sort of this mental clutter, energetic clutter, there was a lot of steps that would go between a thought and then me sharing any part of myself. And that was
Mhm.
part of why I wasn't so embodied. I was definitely like spending all this time in between in my head, deciding, is this something I will say? Will I not say it? And
Right.
why?
Right. So we're getting caught up in comparisonitis.
Mm-hmm.
And then I imagine the individuals that come into the group dynamic initially, they're struggling with a sense of belonging. They're feeling unlovable. They're often spinning in mental clutter. And so that you're helping them not just through individual work, but also group work to help them drop into their bodies, drop into their self-trust, to
Mm-hmm.
move that mental clutter out of the way because they're just getting in their own way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And sort of making up these stories about themselves and other people, that
Mhm.
everybody else is having an easier time, that everybody else can do it, stuff that they are struggling to do.
Yeah. We talked a little bit off camera about retreats.
Mm-hmm.
And the last two retreats that I facilitated, there was a mikvah ceremony that we did. And a mikvah is it's a water submersion. And without sharing the details of that, it aren't as important. The reason I bring up the story is it's this outdoor, very private space. And the women were given the option to go nude or in a bathing suit or whatever they chose to do. And for many women, when I talked to them about some of the most profound aspects of the retreat, it was that, because it's striking to see how many of them chose to go nude in a really safe container. And what they realized is they're sitting here watching, 15, 20 women, all different ages and shapes and colors and sizes, and seeing their beauty.
Yeah.
Like seeing their beauty to the point that it brought them to tears, dropped them to their knees. And they realized, if I'm here honoring these women's beauty, why am I looking in the mirror with so much judgment? And so what I'm hearing is, it's like that experience for me is so palpable, but the group dynamic can create that.
Very much so. Very similar, because the vulnerability can be just like being nude, right? So we're out there and really feeling very exposed when we share some of those real inner parts of ourselves, and to be able to connect with other people from the place of really appreciating that beauty, because that is part of what I get the honor of witnessing between women that either do retreats that I am facilitating or are part of my groups, but the love between them and the appreciation that they express to each other. And when they really show those parts of themselves, how much the others appreciate it, and then feel permission to share similar parts of themselves. And it's really
So
beautiful.
is most of your work all with women?
Most of it is, but I have a small group that I just started that is a man and a woman. There's just two that are starting this one group. So it's a man and a woman together. So I would invite all genders. And the group that really changed my life was men and women. And there is something to be said for both. I think that safe spaces, all women, can be very special, but also navigating through real life stuff with other people is also very powerful.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts and questions that are running through my mind. So for those that are listening, I don't know if they can relate to this. Often what gets in my way, or has in the past, is I like to feel smart. I tend to be a bit of a perfectionist. And, I'm Yale educated and functional medicine trained. And so the more I've allowed myself to soften and show the quote unquote weakness, or the rough edges and the parts that aren't perfect and the things that I don't know, it's been painful, but I also feel like it makes me feel more human and real and approachable. I'm curious if that's something that you see often.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we all have our things that we bring into adulthood. So for some, it is something like what you describe, where somebody is so used to excelling and sort of doing well in certain situations and leading with that capacity. And so to be able to let some of that down and not lead in that way and let themselves be seen more fully, I think is definitely something that I see. And each person, when they're in whatever situation, retreat, or group that they're working on, has an opportunity to identify what it is they're working on. So if somebody is in a similar situation that you just described, let's say they're not even able to soften, they're really struggling with the softening part, and instead they catch themselves maybe dismissing some of what other people in group have to say.
Yeah.
And I often do sort of a combination of group and individual so that people have a chance to really process, well, what is coming up for you, and what, where do we go from here? And together we decide what would be really helpful to work on. So it could be the softening, it could be identifying that you're withdrawing because you're dismissing some of what other people have to say, or whatever it might be, and starting to figure out how to start communicating so that your needs are being met. I mean, the only reason to address it at all is if it's in some ways in the way for you, and probably it's separating.
Yeah. And I think of in the group dynamic, I had a VIP client. She was like, oh, no, 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 I don't do groups. And to her credit, she has kind of a high profile life. And I think that creates some complexity.
Yeah.
There was another one who what did she say? She said, I don't want to talk about stupid stuff. And I went, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Like, who are we to define stupid stuff? And that's one of the beauties of a group dynamic, and that might be your medicine to show up with some patience.
Yeah.
Or the woman who will think that her story or her contribution doesn't add value, so she tends to sit in a group dynamic and be silent.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you can just touch on how a group dynamic can help us access our truest selves in a way that's different than individual coaching. And I hear you and I both do a mixture of both.
Yes.
Even in my group program, they still receive one-on-one time. I see value in both, but some resist the group dynamic. Can you just speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what probably people don't really understand is that group is not a way to kind of put people together so that we as a facilitator can just say things once and make it easier in that way, which I think sometimes people think it's a lesser product. It's like, oh, people are just putting people together in a group, but it's not really to add benefit. And I think what happens though is we touch on unconscious stuff. When we're in a group situation, we don't necessarily know what's going to resonate for us or what's going to touch something really deep. And we're going to start to hear things from other people that sometimes can really annoy us, sometimes can really inspire us, or we can feel connected with. But all of that's such helpful information. If you're going into a session and you're bringing some of your sort of what you want to share and talk about with either your coach or your therapist or whoever it is, and it's just the two of you, you don't have the benefit of sort of these responses to other people that might be bringing up something you have no desire to talk about. And then what's that about? I actually had when I was in the group situation that I was in, there was a woman in group that was talking about this high school reunion situation that she had been to. And she was like sharing it. She wasn't really talking about her own emotional work at this event. She was just sharing it. So it felt very light. And I used to travel from New York City. I mean, from Westchester County, which is north of New York City, into the city when I went to this group. So it was quite a commitment of time, energy, going into this space. And I remember sitting there thinking, I don't want to talk about our high school reunion.
Right.
And I didn't know what to do about it. That became my work. Being able to say, I'm sitting here and I'm struggling because I care about you. And I know you're sharing this with us, but I find myself feeling impatient. And so I was able to find words to express how I was feeling without being harsh to this other person. That was my work. And so I think for us in any kind of group situation, to start to try to identify, well, what's my work there? And that's where the individual can also be helpful because it's a shared experience. So we're also seeing each other, myself with other clients, and then being able to see them later individually. We've had this shared social experience.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know about you, but for my group program, I'm also selective of who I allow in the space. If it's someone who's a complainer, super victim mentality, as much as they need it, I also need to make sure that I'm not bringing someone else in that's going to consistently hurt the group dynamic.
Yeah,
Or there's some people will kind of cannibalize the space and take a lot of time. And so it also is the responsibility of the facilitator to help navigate that. I
that's
was
right.
just hosting a webinar right before I hopped on here, and it
Mhm.
was small, it was intimate, and there was a woman kind of sharing her experience. And these are all women. I mean, it's just a free webinar, and none of them knew one another. It wasn't a container of a group. And she was saying,
Mhm.
"Oh, enough. Stop giving me so much attention. Everyone's important here." And I said, "Yes. And we also have to remember that every person is listening through their own lens, through their own
Mhm.
filter. And so, yes, they're here supporting you, but also they're listening to it in how it relates to them."
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
and I think that that aspect of a group dynamic becomes so potent and powerful.
totally.
Curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I was just really thinking about the woman that you said made that comment, and I hear that so much from various people. People
Mhm.
have a hard time taking up space sometimes.
Yeah.
And so both are true. Yes, there's real value in her sharing and other people being able to benefit from seeing themselves through some of what's happening. And there's real benefit for people to tolerate
Hmm.
that sort of taking up space, the attention being on them, and letting that in, receiving that.
Hmm. When I was in midwifery school at Yale, I did I don't remember how long it was, but I got trained in centering pregnancy. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Mm,
It's prenatal care in group dynamic. And one of the things that I thought was so fascinating is the objective, at least in that framework, is there's
mhm,
all these pregnant women coming in together for their
mhm.
quote unquote prenatal.
Yeah.
Each woman will step aside to get her belly measured and to listen to fetal heart tones and get a blood pressure and that piece.
Mhm,
But the chairs are all in a circle. And what they said is my job is not to give the answers. My job is to create the environment where the women give each other the answers. So, as an example, someone's pregnant and really struggling with heartburn. Okay.
mhm,
I could
mhm,
give the answer of what to do, but instead to the group, say, is anyone else experiencing that? And what have
mhm.
you tried? So
Yeah.
that really my only job in that setting was to make sure that everyone was safe. Like
Mhm.
if someone said, I drink alcohol for my heartburn, then I'm going to step in and go, okay, wait.
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah,
a
yeah.
safe solution. But I love, at least in that setting, my role as a facilitator for a group prenatal visit was really to be quiet and on the sidelines and allow the group to be the one to lead.
Yeah.
I'm curious if that feels resonant with you and in how you do your group work from a mental health perspective and all the ways that you serve.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I love watching them respond to each other. And I
Mhm.
think what often happens is they're picking up on things that I'm not even thinking about. Like I've got my own lens and I'm paying attention to what people bring in there. But the depth that they can really get into amongst themselves is just wonderful to watch, but often there are surprises in that. And I love being able to sort of see what comes up. And then I learn different things about different clients as they're sharing in groups. So I think that's amazing. It's interesting what you're saying because I think a couple of things. One, yes, if somebody can offer some different suggestions about experiences that they've had and what they've tried and what's been successful, that can be really helpful. But sometimes, and this is where it becomes a bit of a delicate balance, if we go too much into answers or the idea of fixing it or that kind of thing, we may be missing some of the depth underneath. And so I'm always paying attention to if we're going into problem solving mode and staying there to
Mhm.
bring us back out and let's kind of touch more on some of what's coming up for people emotionally. What are you feeling? If somebody's really getting energized and wanting to go in and sort of try and solve something for somebody, that's often a time when I ask that person who's jumping in, what's going on for you. I see it's bringing up a lot of
Mhm.
energy for you. And so we kind of explore all these different layers at once. There's a lot of different things that
Mhm.
are so powerful and so valuable.
A two-part question. For the individuals that lean into your work, what do you think are some of the biggest um, obstacles, so to speak, in their way that leave them feeling most afraid of group work? And on the other side, what do you see as some of the most profound outcomes of individuals saying yes, doing the group work specifically with you? What's on the other
Mm.
end?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what scares people most of all is what we've been talking about, like being vulnerable with other people. They're being vulnerable with me. And so I think they're imagining, oh, can I bring this work that we're doing into a setting with other people? So there's a lot of fear there about the vulnerability piece. And I think there's also fear of neglect, like that's people
Mm.
get afraid that, oh, if there's other people in the room, I'm not going to get my needs met. I'm
Uh-huh.
going to have to share my time and my what I'm getting from you now with other people. And I think there's a lot of worry that they're not going to get their needs met. And I think that's where the sort of misunderstanding of what the benefits of group can be. What
Yeah.
I have experienced many times is when people do say yes and they go into the group, and not always, for some people, it doesn't end up being a good fit. But for most people, they get in there and they say to me, often when it's somebody's been resistant for a bit, oh, I get it now. And so
Mm.
it doesn't take long for people to start to feel held in that space and
Yeah.
to be able to be seen, to be able to, there's the accountability piece for people to be able to be seen. I
Mhm.
think when people kind of don't wait for me to sort of bring them out and they're jumping in with each other after they've started to get to know each other a little bit and say to each other, oh, what's happening with, and they're following up with each other because they want to know how everything is evolving for each other. They're really rooting for each other. There's such a
Mhm.
sort of this team that gets put
Mhm.
together.
And so your groups, do they all start and end together, or is there any open enrollment where people can be coming and going?
Yeah, I actually leave it open. I've tried it lots of different ways, and I
Mhm.
think I like the people come in when they're ready for group, and then sometimes somebody's ready to leave before another person, and that's just part of the group conversation. But that mimics real life. We have people that come in and out of our lives at various times. And so
Mhm.
I think there's always a little bit of fear when somebody's like, oh, somebody new is coming in, but we're all good here. And so I think sometimes people are really uncomfortable with
Yeah.
the idea of somebody who is going to kind of join this already tight group. But what we find, and we talk about it, if somebody new is coming in again, they say, well, so and so was new in group, since you started. And I know you were a little bit afraid of that, but I
Yeah.
know you guys really care about
Yeah.
each other.
Yeah. I do the same thing. And sometimes I wonder if it would make more sense to try on like an end and beginning where
Mm-hmm.
everybody's together. But I really appreciate this kind of fluid, dynamic nature. And just because they've signed up for receiving group and individual from me doesn't mean that they even show up on every group call.
Right.
So every
That's right.
group has its own individual dynamic.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing that as I was listening to you, I don't know about you, but I feel like there's always a moment in my year-long program, there's always a moment where someone will say, I've never said this out loud to others before, but,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
there's always like inside, I'm dancing, going, okay, we
Totally.
did it.
I
Can you
love
relate
that.
to that?
Oh my God, I love that. I mean, that's really the biggest honor, the biggest joy when people start to feel safe enough
Yeah.
to share more and sort of start to get into some of the stuff that's felt too scary in the past.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then the second part to my however many questions
Mm.
ago
Yeah.
was on the other side. What do you see as the long-term benefits? Like, what do your clients celebrate when they've finished a group experience and
Mhm.
now they're changed, so to speak?
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
what way do you see that change show up?
I feel like people are just so much more peaceful with themselves after having
Hmm.
had a group situation. It's almost like, and I feel this way, that you can sort of bring your group people with you as you're processing through things and
Yeah.
kind of imagining, what would they have said if you brought this to the group's attention, and or what was said in the past, because many times sort of we're facing things that are similar to things we've already faced and that maybe have talked about. And
Hmm.
so I think there's just an added ability to check in with ourselves, honor ourselves, be at peace with ourselves. When you've gone through that kind of a group journey, and from that place, then it's just much more easy to navigate whatever big decisions you're trying to get through and
Yeah.
to make.
Yeah. So just simply more inner peace.
Yeah.
And we go back to that initial inner dialogue of I'm not lovable. It
Mm-hmm.
seems like in a group dynamic, um, what is it that I was talking to a client the other day and she said, I don't just want to be in the space and then observe how I change.
Mm-hmm.
My objective is to observe myself in the midst of consuming the material. And it's like, right. But my point is that inner peace on the back end becomes the reality because it's not just that these individuals are learning and building new skill sets, but they're
Mm-hmm.
in self observation
Yeah.
along the journey and they're in the awareness of, oh, there's that pattern again of me assuming I'm not lovable, assuming I'm not going to belong, assuming my words don't add value here. And
Mm-hmm.
when we look in the mirror, being given these other individuals in the group dynamic as that reflection,
Mm-hmm.
it like becomes undeniable. And so I think what I'm hearing, and this is my experience as well, what I'm hearing from you is when they dig in and stick with the group, don't jump
Mm-hmm.
ship when it gets tough and it gets
Yeah.
confronting, but stick with it. On the other end is a whole lot of inner peace.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what you were saying about this client, this idea of in process, like it's not just, okay, now after I've had a chance to think about it and settle and look back, find the peace, but actually find the peace through the struggle, through the living through it, through the I'm in it, I'm in the nitty gritty of it.
Yep.
And I'm catching my breath and I'm saying kind things to myself. And I believe I can move to the next step.
Oh, she says, I want to study myself through the material versus studying the material through me.
Ah, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I thought
Yeah.
that was really profound. Mic
Mm-hmm.
drop moment.
Yeah.
Okay. So then there's this piece of women, and for some, often I hear women say, my friends left me, they didn't include me, I felt betrayed, my trust was broken. I've been taught that it's not okay for me to be vulnerable in front of other women.
Mm-hmm.
They took my boyfriend. There's competitiveness, there's cattiness, all of that baggage
Yeah.
that many women have added on and they're carrying on their backs coming into the group.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you have thoughts around that specifically, women amongst women, and
Yeah.
how do you navigate the group dynamic so that they can change the narrative and actually allow the vulnerability and allow the boundaries to
Mm.
shift?
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're describing is probably what is a lot of the resistance is about, oh, I can't go. It doesn't feel safe. It's not going to be necessarily true that I'm going to be supported in that kind of a space. My experiences have not been that. So I think that is the kind of thing that keeps people from deciding yes.
Mm-hmm.
My experiences have been in various settings. So it's retreats that I've both facilitated and been on, and groups that I've facilitated and been a part of. it's the container. The container that gets created will help people feel safe enough to start taking that journey together. And it's pretty immediate. There's something about, however, I'm not quite sure what it is that people might be picking up on the groups and the retreats that I do, but I do find my experience is that there's an immediate sense of safety.
Yep.
Probably people know me at different levels. So somebody who's known me longer might take more of a risk going first. And then once somebody has started to share, then other people feel a little bit safer. And then when that becomes clear that that's what we do here and it's safe to do here, I think people feel like it's okay to do it in that space, and then can sort of let the connection happen.
Yep. Absolutely. And the big piece is this is a container.
Yeah.
Like this isn't you out in the real world at the PTA, is that what it's called? I'm not part of the PTA committee meetings, or at work or at the grocery store, on the team sports, whatever. It's not that. This is a very specific container with very clear holding and kind of agreed upon guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
And so for individuals who are noticing their resistance, to be able to acknowledge this is not the recreation of those old experiences. This is a very different, opening and closing container.
Yeah.
You talked in your bio and at the beginning, you talked about clearing energetic and mental clutter.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, how does that affect or influence the group process?
Yeah. So what I mean when I say energetic clutter, I'm referring to all the things that demand our focus, our energy, our time even, that are not helping us to move the needle towards growth or meaning or how we want to feel. So an example of that could be an old, antiquated, limiting belief. We all have them that we've mostly carried from childhood, from the families that we've grown up in and the cultures that we've grown up in. Sometimes they get developed later in life, but they are things. I'll share my own. One that I had to really get mindful of and work very deliberately on, besides the not lovable part, was people pleasing. Like, felt that if I'm not agreeable, if I don't say yes to things, then people will abandon me. And so that was something that I caught myself as I learned more and more about just these different limiting beliefs, and recognize, oh, I do this thing where I'm more accommodating to another person than I am to myself. What's that about? And so if we take this idea that we all are holding on to different things, that we have to hustle for our worth, that being productive is better than sort of resting or having fun, that taking care of others is more important than taking care of ourselves. There's lots of different, very common ones, and then we all have our own nuanced versions. But I think it's so important for somebody to start learning, well, what are the ones that each of us are carrying, so that we don't let them run the show. So in a group situation, it can be really helpful to start to highlight some of what you might be carrying. I mean, we very deliberately talk about different topics, and one would be limiting beliefs. We would talk about that directly. But also, let's say somebody is very much into this caretaking idea that, oh, I take care of others, that's how I get my worth. They're probably going to do it in group. So in group, they might be the person who's going to step in, and rather than bring their own issues to the front, might start to try and bring up some support for other people. And so that would be the kind of thing that we would talk about directly, depending on how I'm working with each of the people. It might be something that I would share separately first, and then sort of we would decide together that it would be something to work on, and that we would together sort of bring it into the group situation. So group can be really helpful in working on it, recognizing it, seeing it in action, seeing what comes up for people, hearing what they say, but hearing themselves talk, you know.
Hmm. So what I'm hearing is the energetic clutter is really those self-limiting beliefs, the upper limiting, those patterns that
Mm-hmm.
when you're one-on-one might not necessarily have the opportunity to be expressed. But
That's
when you
right.
bring in a group dynamic, it's inevitable that we really have to see ourselves in the midst of others because those patterns are going to show up and the group facilitator is able to really see them. And
Mm-hmm.
then when you're doing one-on-one time, you can address it a little bit more head on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so it's like the patterns of belief, but also we have behavioral patterns that go along with those ideas. So yeah,
Hmm.
if we believe certain things about, let's say, hustling for our worth, it might not necessarily show up in the group while it's happening, but it shows up in how we talk about our lives outside of the group. So we might be
Hmm.
talking about like, yes, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm exhausted. And so then we talk about, well, what about rest? And somebody who's struggling that with that one will also struggle to follow through. They may intellectually get it and say, oh,
Hmm.
yeah, of course, rest is a good idea. Let me do that. But there's often a real emotional struggle for some of these changes to feel safe enough to make. And that's part of the journey. So
Hmm.
that gets identified. We talk about that and we kind of come back to it as as we try to do different things and stuff comes up for us.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, do you listen to much Alison Armstrong? Are you familiar with Alison Armstrong?
Mm-mm, mm-mm.
She studies the male and female
Oh,
brain.
I feel like
Um,
I heard you mention it on one of your podcasts,
I
actually.
interviewed
Okay.
her on the
Okay.
and she's I think she's brilliant, but she talks about the female brain that we function in what she calls diffuse awareness.
Mm.
And she goes back to like hunter-gatherer days where
Mhm.
a typical male brain is hunting, kind of single-minded focus. Um,
Mhm.
she gives the example, he might look in the pantry and he's looking for a can of black beans and he doesn't think to move the can out of the way. It's just right back there. He doesn't see it, so he's
Mhm.
going to run to the store to go buy it. Versus she uses the example of women as gatherers, they'll go out into the field and they're paying
Mhm.
attention to the weather patterns. They can hear the
Mhm.
laughter of their children. They know where the children are. They're paying attention to the animals that might be there, but also here's this berry bush. And they're going to look at, okay, there's berries back there on that side will be ripe tomorrow. These are ripe today.
Mhm.
And the way that that expresses is a tip, what I hear from Allison is a typical woman will come down the stairs and she has diffuse awareness. So this emotional labor playing in the back at all times. She might
Mhm.
see there's dishes that need to be done, there's dust on the mantle. She's thinking of the appointments that need to be made, the places she need to be, the kids' lunches that need to be packed. And so in a female brain, she's thinking about all of these things at all times.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I'm just curious when you're talking about energetic clutter, it's, I think most women, we have the ability to manage a lot more mental clutter in general.
Mhm. Mhm.
And nonetheless, we still will overcommit ourselves,
Right.
overserve, and
Yeah.
end up on overload.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts around that and how it's showing up in a group dynamic and how the group dynamic really benefits um, women, not only in like the awareness of the excess clutter, but
Mhm.
also the streamlining of how to reduce it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm just thinking, as you're talking about it, it's a bit the blessing and the curse, right? On the one
Yeah.
hand, we're so good at it. On the other hand, it is impacting sort of our ability to really connect and be sort of in our lives in a way that we really are feeling that presence that we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just to even start to recognize it, start to name it, start to see what some of the consequences are to living that way. So it could be great, we're very successful, we've been able to achieve many things, but we're exhausted. We're using alcohol to like take the edge off when we finally sit down, or anger ends up sort of just being something that bubbles over at the end of the night, and that kind of thing, where starting to see what is the cost though of living
Mhm.
that way. And so that's a really helpful beginning. And in fact, I think that's the way in. If somebody's starting to want to get more clear about what the energetic clutter is that they carry, I think starting from some of the pain points. Are you irritable much of the time? Are you feeling that you're resentful a lot of the time? Who is it that you're saying yes to when what you really want to do is say no? What do you give yourself permission for? What do you not give yourself permission for?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so starting to really name some of those things, look at all the layers.
Mhm.
And I think the group dynamic is really helpful because we can, number one, hear ourselves sharing with other people. So just hearing ourselves share it, it carries a different kind of a weight. And then just having that reflected back to us when other
Mhm.
people are sort of responding to us and bringing up what comes up for them, which often is very similar.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then they also come to me because their adrenals have crashed and their thyroid's off and their hormones aren't being
That's right.
produced.
That's
And
right.
I think the other thing is, I don't know about you, but I often observe um, women spending more time up in their head and their thinking space and not feeling or
Mm-hmm.
not dropping into their bodies.
That's
I
right.
imagine that that's another cue for you. Anyway, we're
Yeah.
I'm just aware of our time, and I have your Instagram, your Facebook, and your website both in the Facebook Live as well as in the show notes. Can you just tell the listeners a little bit about who do you work with? What's the best way for them to reach out to you? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I work mostly with women. I would say women 30s through 60s mostly. And often
Mhm.
it's very much around helping people connect to lives that they're much more excited to be living. I think I work with people who experience a lot of feelings of depletion or just feeling like, isn't there more to this life thing, and not able to connect to their life satisfaction in the way they really long for. And yeah, so the best way to reach me, connect to me, is my website, which I have an easier to remember handle, which is clearenergeticclutter.com. And on there, there's various goodies. You can connect to my Instagram from there. I have information about our next retreat, which I don't know when this is going to go on the website, but that's going to be in October. And in Cold Spring, New York is where that's located. And yeah, and then the other thing, I just wanted to hop back for 1 second to what you said about when people are really sort of struggling to with their physical stuff you were talking about, but I'm just also thinking about intuition is such a powerful tool. And when we're not getting quiet enough and really connecting to ourselves enough, we can't really access that. So I just think just to hop on that idea that
Yeah.
getting quiet to connect to your intuition is
Yeah.
really
And
important.
it sounds like sometimes the resistance to being in a group dynamic might be the resistance to actually being seen, but both to see yourself in the
That's right.
context of the group or to allow yourself to be seen in a group,
Yeah.
and that being a way to access our intuition even more deeply.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you'd like to add that feels unfinished? Any last parting words?
I think I often say this at the very end, but be kind to yourself through the process. So many
Mhm.
of us have very harsh inner critics. And I think to take some of these emotional risks and start to allow yourself to be seen and start to do some of this work to look at yourself, we can get harsh. So be kind to yourself.
Yeah, be kind to yourself. Well, Tanya, thanks you so much for your time and for what you do in the world and all the ways that you're supporting individuals, both virtually and in person with retreats. I also, I don't know about you, but I feel like the virtual work is such a blessing to be able to bring people together from around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we gather in person,
It's
it's
beautiful.
just it's like we just it's the work on steroids, and the
Yeah.
connections become that much deeper. And so I'm so grateful that you're doing a mixture of both.
Yeah. And thank you for having me as a guest and for the work that you're doing in the world.
Yeah, of course. My
Yeah.
pleasure.